in Asia, right? And so that's the archaeology bit there, I guess. With regard to European bias, yeah, reading historical accounts of Africa means understanding how race was conceptualized historically, how that was portrayed in different ways in discussing people and the things that people were doing. And for the most part, Europeans, saw Africa as a primitive place, a place where people didn't come up with and have creative ideas on their own, but they just sort of mimicked or aped ideas that were imported from elsewhere. And so people ignored the fact that there was, smoking pipes, for instance, there. But in terms of the use of plants and plant medicines, whether it's cannabis or something else, Europeans a lot of times just looked at that as some very, primitive thing that didn't have any meaning other than just showing kind of these stereotypes of Africa and Africans, which, is problematic in trying to understand the history. And so in reading the historical documents, you have to kind of look at those things and kind of parse out, well, how much of this is just kind of these ethnocentric judgments? How much of this is actual some degree of ethnographic observation? And, kind of parsing out the ethnographic observation, we can find that people had very specific medicinal uses and other material uses for cannabis. And, those are valuable to recognize and those are valuable to see because it provides us precedent for understanding how people might use cannabis today or in other points in time.
I do want to delve into your thoughts about the origins of the racism that is associated with cannabis today in terms of relating it back to the slave trade, which obviously originated in Africa. But before then, I also wanted to go back to something that you said, that a lot of the archaeology coming out of Africa just hasn't really paid much attention to whether or not there was cannabis there. And I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though in order to find and really recognize the use or the importance of finding cannabis, archaeologists kind of have to know about it and be looking for it, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and that's certainly something. And a broader problem with archaeology is that, in the past, up until just, fairly recently, people were only looking for like clear human-made artifacts, right? The stone statue and the stone pipe bowl and things like that. And all the other stuff, the detritus that was kind of packed in with the human artifacts was just thrown out. And so, people are, archaeologists are more attentive to that and are seeking plant remains, seeking seeds and other sorts of things that you can, that plants might leave behind. But yeah, in many cases, people just haven't really looked for that. And that's not just in Africa, but it's elsewhere as well. And, in Africa, limitation is that there just hasn't been as many sites explored as there has been in Asia or in Europe, other places where there's ancient cannabis. In the places where people have done the work and have been attentive for it, there's a lot of times been evidence found, but there is just kind of a neglect of it, of the plant and just kind of plant use more generally in African sites.
So when you talk about the origins of the racism of cannabis, as it's permeated our criminal justice system, it's permeated the policies that have been made around cannabis. And if you look at the origins of a lot of the people who were brought over here against their will and the use of cannabis in what would now be the African American culture and the racism that's associated with that, how would you make the connection between the more ancient studies of cannabis and use of cannabis, making the arc to where we are now or where it was when the slave trade was originated here in the United States? I mean, how does the racism relate back to the findings of the origins of use of cannabis in Africa itself?
Okay, so that's a big question. So the big context, and this is, what I'll say now kind of comes out of my background in African studies, is the concept of race that we have, and of categories like black and white, in terms of racial categories, that traces back to the slave trade, right? Before there was commercial slavery in the Atlantic world, Europeans and others didn't have the concepts that we take for granted nowadays of black and white, racial categories. Those categories came out as a kind of intellectual justification for slavery, for treating people like property, like animals, right? And so the language that we use and the thinking that a lot of people have is fundamentally derived from the African slave trade. And that's not because everyone is individually like buying into racist ideologies. It's just the basic language and concepts that we have, traced to a very specific point in time. And so when Europeans started really paying attention to cannabis, in the 1800s, really after about 1820 or 1830, something like that, they were using the language and the concepts about human difference that existed at that point in time. And, when they were writing about cannabis, whether they were writing about it in the Levant, what we now think of as the Middle East, or if they were working in Africa in some places, they looked at the behaviors that people had through these racial categories. And so it was looking at what people were doing with these particular plants and understanding that as a characteristic feature of these different racial categories in many cases, right? And the challenge with cannabis is that in historic European thought, it has these two really kind of politically charged uses. One is as historical hemp, meaning in this case fiber and oil seeds and things like that. And European countries, the kings and the admirals, they really found hemp as fiber in particular very important because it was important for maintaining, naval power, maritime power. And so they saw that and they framed that as this is the way that cannabis should be used. And if you look at the history of botanical taxonomy, that kind of valuation of the European perception of how cannabis should be used, that's integrated into our thinking about the plant taxonomy, not just how people were interacting with it. And so when Europeans historically saw non-Europeans, other people, whether it was from South Asia or Africa or wherever, using cannabis as a drug, they saw that as being this just wrong-headed thing to do, that they kind of incorporated within, into their racial categories as being this negative thing that these other categories of people do. And so that was written into the cannabis historical record, right? And so if you go back and you read the historical documents, it's, associating this particular plant use, all right, as a smoked drug in general, with these particular racial categories. And in colonial context in Africa, those racial categories and those perceptions of plant use were immediately incorporated into laws, the first drug control laws. A lot of these were explicitly racist and explicitly directed towards Africans, right, and aiming specifically at the hard laborers who were the most common, or at least most commonly observed, users of the drugs. And so international prohibition really traces to colonial Africa. That's where the initial drug laws against cannabis were developed, and in the negotiations that led up to there was a couple of international drug control agreements that were enacted in the early 20th century in 1912 and 1925. Leading up to 1925, South Africa and Egypt, those were the places that said we should ban cannabis globally, and they succeeded, right? And so cannabis became, controlled after 1925 because of the views of, the white minority government in South Africa and the government in Egypt. Now, a lot of times what happens in cannabis histories, and if you read literature on cannabis, it focuses just on the United States. And that's important, right? The United States has had a significant role, obviously, in international drug control. It's also important to recognize that most of the documents, most of the literature written about cannabis is written by Americans. And so the people who've written the literature have been very concerned about what's happening in the United States and what happened in the United States. And in the United States, the 1920s, the 1930s, that was the context where cannabis became illegal. And there's basically two broad reasons why people wanted to make cannabis controlled in the United States. One was pharmaceutical practice. There was a lot of problems with the cannabis pharmaceuticals that were on the market in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There was a lot of more broader set of problems with just pharmaceutical quality and patent medicines and things like that. And so there was a lot of laws in the early 20th century worldwide about controlling pharmacy practice, and cannabis was listed in there because it was considered a pharmaceutical. And so there's restrictions on that. The other kind of motivation for early drug control or cannabis control laws in the United States were concerns that it caused health problems, right? And it's important to understand that those concerns, a lot of those traced back to colonial insane asylums in South Africa, in Egypt, in South Asia, where you had these Western doctors, European doctors, that whenever somebody came in with some sort of a mental health crisis, if the doctors didn't know what was going on, they said, well, it must be cannabis. And so therefore cannabis causes mental illness was how it was perceived. And so people in the United States saw that, and they said, well, we don't want this problem to happen. We don't seem to have this problem, but let's prohibit cannabis as a drug anyway, right, to kind of prevent this problem from happening. And so you had those kind of two motivations come together to lead towards formal federal prohibition in the 1930s. And in the 1930s and subsequently, a lot of times drugs and drug control were represented and portrayed in racial terms, in racist terms. And that's common knowledge to people who have read any cannabis literature. And there was a lot of concern about controlling people, is really where what the motivation was there. And that control was expressed in the language of the time, the language that to us is very racist and was racist then, but was more acceptable. And so attributing cannabis to certain groups, that's what was done, right? Whether it was Mexicans, not meaning the nationality, but kind of the pejorative term of just Spanish speakers in the United States, it was attributed to those groups of people. And we still have this kind of attribution that certain groups of people are, associated with certain drugs. And so in order to, control these drugs, it means we need to target certain people. And so what's the link, between the US context and the African context? It's really kind of associating particular drugs with particular groups of people. And you have this deep-seated racism that's expressed in how laws are enforced and whatnot, that kind of creates these patterns that exist worldwide, right? Very long answer.
It's fascinating, though. It really is fascinating, especially when you look at the origins of the perceptions. And I've often just attributed the blatant racism associated with cannabis here in the United States to that very sinister but highly effective public relations campaign, the Reefer Madness, which so successfully permeated the collective American psyche, and that has lasted for so long. It's really been a tough stigma to eliminate because of those associations, and especially like with the migrant farm workers. And culturally, I guess the campaign tried to make the association that it was going to cause dangerous behavior, and especially within those groups, the labor groups in the South. So it's very fascinating. So, but thank you for explaining it so well, because I think that this is just a piece of the historical context that kind of gets lost in our vernacular today.
And yeah, so I mean, that perception thing is really important. And in the work that I've done on cannabis, what is really missing is an understanding that historically cannabis was something that was associated with class, not race, right? And a lot of people have kind of perpetuated this notion of drug use in general or cannabis in particular